Hello to everyone watching on YouTube as well, and welcome to today's presentation on language groups in and around Europe. We will start with a general map of Europe and around it, with some language groups marked on it. Let's start with the largest one. In blue, we have the Indo-European language family, which is named here oppositely to the reason that it is named so, because it is spoken largely in Europe and India. This is actually the largest language family in the world. Now, hello, Pete, and welcome. Spoken by more than 3 billion individuals, so Indo-European speakers are almost a half of the global population. Another very large language group are the Afro-Asiatic languages, and here you can clearly see why they are called so. They are spoken in northern, northeastern Africa and in southwestern Asia. The third group, here in yellow, are the Turkic languages. Fairly late comer to Europe, but politically the Turks have been very meaningful and impactful, particularly in southeastern Europe. The fourth large language group, although the smallest of these, are the Uralic languages. I do not think you will be able to see under all these colors, but the name Uralic here is written on top of the Uralic mountains, and these languages are spoken on both sides of these mountains, and they get their names from them. Then there are further 3 small language groups. One is Basque, which you will see here marked. It is commonly called the original language of Europe. This is most likely not true. Most likely the Basque languages came from northern Africa during the Stone Age. But what they are the oldest surviving languages in Europe, possibly. Because the last 2 language groups, which are unfortunately too small to label on this map, are the Northern Caucasian and Southern Caucasian, or Kartvelian. Kartvelian is Georgian for Georgian. So these are the Southern Caucasian languages, are those closely related to Georgian. The Northern Caucasian languages do not have any particularly famous members. Let's start with a bit of background information before we get to the language groups themselves. First, what actually is a language family, and how do we differentiate between languages that we say are genetically related, as in form a language family, and languages that are areally related, that is, they have affected each other but do not have a common ancestry or origin. When it comes to language families, in some cases with closely related languages, it is fairly obvious when they are related. For example, between Estuary English and Boston English, you will immediately be able to tell that these are members of the same language. When we get to, for example, Estuary English and Scots, it is not quite as clear. The relationship is not quite as modern, but you will still be able to tell that they are clearly related. This is often the case. You will be able to find a clearly closely related language for most of the languages in the world, but at some point you have to move between these clearly closely related groups. And when it comes to that, we mostly actually use vocabulary, grammar less so. Grammar can actually change fairly rapidly in the development of a language. For example, compare modern English to Old English or the other continental Germanic languages, and you will notice that the grammar has changed radically, but this of course does not mean that English is no longer a Germanic language. So what we use are cognates. Cognates are by definition words that used to be the same word, but they have developed in a different way in the different languages. Usually, these have fairly similar meanings, and they have a systematic correspondence with each other. If you watch the presentation on snapshots on the road to English, you will have learned quite a long list of systematic morphological correspondences. So these are the kind that, for example, capere, to grasp, in Latin, is cognate to have in English. You can see that the meanings are quite similar, and the systematic correspondence is that words that used to have a K in them have turned into a H in the Germanic languages. And this is systematic. You will be able to find many, many, many words that have undergone this process. Another good sign that family languages might be related is when they have common core vocabulary, such as family members, body parts, the sky, some religious concepts, and so on. I think I touched on this as well last time with Maltese, which is an Arabic language that has been thoroughly relexicalized with Latin vocabulary, but the core vocabulary, and in this case the grammar, still remain very Arabic. And to say the last step is to have an explanation. What kind of a process would have led to both of these observations from different languages? Sometimes this is a simple change, as in the capere haben, have, pair, in which case only one language group has gone through a change and the other one has remained the way it was. Sometimes both groups have diverged in different ways. For example, between the Finnish and Estonian languages, badger, a medium-sized animal with white stripes along its back, originally was called mäkrä, but this has developed into mäyrä in Finnish and mäkerä in Estonian. So you can use these languages to fairly easily come to the original form of this word, but neither of them are really any closer to the original than the other one. And then the other way that languages can come to be similar to each other is language contact, which we will have an entire episode at some point. But here you have to remember, when you are looking at similar words between languages, that often recent loan words, so not interesting for the origin of language, are often too perfect. They are identical with each other. For example, all around Europe, you will be able to hear the word menu. Menu. This is, of course, not a word that has been inherited. It is a word that has been spread by the social and political dominance of the French language. And you will not be able to find systematic developments from this word because it is far too new in the languages. Often loan words are very domain specific. So you might have language, for example, to get back to the Finnish language as an example, it has a time period in the 1920s and 30s when a huge amount of German loan words entered the language, and these are largely technical vocabulary. And here you will be able to use the fact that a huge amount of technical vocabulary, such as excavating devices, electrical batteries, and that sort of thing, are loan words from a specific language, but these kind of loanwords of this layer are not found in other domains. This is a sign that they are loanwords. In this case, it is quite clear because it has not yet been 100 years. We know that these words were loaned, but if you had a similar case in prehistory, you would not have this a priori information that would yet let you know the answer before thinking about it. And you should remember that both words and grammar can get changed by language contact. As I already alluded to English has changed dramatically as a result of language contact, largely between North Sea Germanic and North Germanic languages. We will get to that in its own episode, I imagine. Then, the next general topic are the time dates of these language families. So when was the original proto-language of this family spoken? These are somewhat guesswork. They are not quite unfounded, but they hide some assumptions that may not be quite correct. Here in the lower group, I have written the languages that were first written from these language families at the time period when they were written. So, Egyptian is an Afro-Asiatic language and it was written before 3000 BC, which is around the time Proto-Indo-European would have been spoken, but that was not written until more than 1,000 years later. The first Indo-European language to be written was Hittite. So clearly, we have to project into the past to start with our information, our input. In this case, our inputs are the written languages that have survived, as well as the living languages that have survived. So having early written information helps us reconstruct languages further into the past, and having a wide variety of surviving languages also helps us reconstruct further into the past. For example, between the Uralic and Turkic languages, the first written information, evidence about these language groups, is about the same age, around the year 1000 AD. But you can see that the age of the reconstructed proto-language is radically different. And this is because, in the case of Uralic, we have a large tree of Uralic languages that have survived, that have split from each other at that point, and descendants of both of these first branches survive until today. This is not really the case for Turkic. We have an idea where the Turkic languages may have been spoken before we get our Western information about them. But it appears that a part of this language group spread to the West, became the Turkic languages, and the other groups stayed in Northeastern Asia and were assimilated into other language groups. And because we have no information about them, we are not able to reconstruct as far into the past as with the Uralic languages. This is also the case with the Afro-Asiatic languages, and in particular, here we have very old written documentation of both Egyptian and Akkadian, which come from different main branches of this language family, and were already at that time quite noticeably different from another. So what we can say without a doubt is that the original Afro-Asiatic language was quite different from either of these. We assume, therefore, that it was spoken far in the past. This is likely, but not necessarily the case. It is a common assumption that languages change at a constant rate, but it is not true. For example, Within the Romance languages, Tuscan and Sardinian are both extremely conservative. They are similar to Latin, whereas French is extremely divergent. And this is not because Latin would have been spoken at a different time in northern France or on the Mediterranean. It is most likely because of differing amounts of foreign influence and social development within these areas. Sardinia, in particular, was extremely peaceful. There were no invading armies, no sudden social upheaval, and it is likely partly because of this that the Sardinian language remains so similar with Latin. So, how do we date and locate these proto-languages? Well, obviously, listening to what I've been going on about for the last 10 minutes, written sources are one source of information, but this only applies to certain language groups. Question: Pig, is the Arab group from Egyptian/Akkadian? I will say yes. The Arabic languages are a part of the Semitic languages, of which Akkadian was also a member. So once we get to the slide that is about the Afro-Asiatic languages, I will draw you a tree that will sort of clarify this. Akkadian is, if we think of languages as individuals, then Akkadian is like an uncle of Arabic, and Egyptian is like a cousin of Akkadian. So, written languages. Some languages were entirely written, like Egyptian, Akkadian. We have entire texts in these languages, prose, poetry, really a good image of the language. In some cases, the written sources are quite weak, such as with epigrams. These are like graffiti, the kind of scratches that you make on building walls to announce something vulgar. This of course also happened in the past and not only today. Sometimes there are runestones that have fairly short messages, usually in prose, but runestones are much more difficult to produce than books, for example. So if you are relying on the runestones, such as with the Northern Germanic languages, you will have a much smaller input group than with fully literate languages. But for example, runestones can date the beginning of Proto-Norse in Scandinavia, since the absolute first runestones did not have the changes in them, but some of the runestones from only 100 or 200 years later have language that has gone through these changes. So we can see roughly at what point in time this process happened. Then dating a language level, so for example Proto-Indo-European, usually is mostly done with the help of vocabulary and specifically what kind of technologies there are words for. For example, for Proto-Indo-European, practically all of the Indo-European languages have common words for wagons and their parts, such as axles, wheels, and that sort of thing. So these words already existed in Proto-Indo-European, and if you have the words for various parts of a wagon, you must have a wagon. So we know that this was a chariot riding culture. On the other hand, for example, Proto-Uralic has vocabulary related to copper and tin and farming, so we can deduce that this language was spoken by a a Bronze Age farming culture. A further way to date developments is by relative chronology. Once some process has happened in one language and a second language takes loan words from the first language, they will be frozen either in the original or the new form. And in this way you can date relative layers in different language groups. For example, here I have 3 examples. The Proto-Uralic language clearly has loanwords from Aryan languages. So the changes from Proto-Indo-European into Aryan had already occurred. And as you might remember from the dates, this is no wonder because Proto-Indo-European seems to be spoken 1000 years before Proto-Uralic. So you would... here we are going backwards in the tree. This is the fact that there are Aryan, specifically Aryan loanwords in Proto-Uralic, is an argument for the fact that the Proto-Indo-European language was spoken earlier than Proto-Uralic. The second example are the Basque and Proto-Romance languages. We know from history when the Romans came into contact with the Basques. And we can see from Basque that all of the Latin loanwords are of the accusative type. So, for example, a flame in Latin was flamma, several flames was flammae or flamme, depending on the time period. And if you would say there are multiple flames, you would say flamme. But if you say I see multiple flames, you would say veo flammas, the accusative. And this is the plural, the normal. This has become the nominative plural, for example, in Spanish, and as I recall, all of the more Western Romance languages. And from Basque, we can see that this process had already begun at the time when Latin came into contact with Basque. So the developments from classical Latin into Proto-Romance must have at least begun by that time, whereas the official written resources we have in Latin are still classical Latin. So this written information that we have is indicative of an older form of the language that was certainly seen as more prestigious. Even today, if we are thinking about English, if you listen to a nature documentary, the speaker will most likely speak a more conservative form of English and not some kind of Zoomer slang. That's just not the kind of context to use this kind of a register. And the last example with the South Sami and Proto-Norse, this is a case of rune stones. We know when certain processes occurred in Proto-Norse, and we can see that the first Norse loanwords in South Sami are ones where this process has already occurred. So it must have happened after that. And as I mentioned, there is often an assumption that languages change at a fixed rate, but this is not the case. When this assumption is used to calculate dates for proto-languages, this is called glottochronology, and it sometimes works, sometimes doesn't, which is the worst kind of works when it comes to science. It is unreliable. Sometimes you get absolute nonsense because the input assumption is false. We know it's not true. So, getting into locating proto-languages. So, how do we know where Proto-Indo-European, for example, was spoken? And this comes back again to vocabulary. You have plants and animals and minerals that you have to have at the area where this language is spoken. If you have a language which is spoken in Europe, and we are talking about the Bronze Age, so we have no internet, you do not expect to have words for tigers. If you can reconstruct a word for tiger in the proto-language, it has to have been spoken in an area with knowledge of tigers. It's the same for plants. You don't, for Arctic cultures, you don't have words for palm trees. For tropical languages, you do not have words for grizzly bears or polar bears. As to minerals, Scandinavia doesn't. Mistake. Northern Scandinavia doesn't have any flint. So when you have a language group such as the Uralic languages, which are present in northern Scandinavia, but have domestic words for flint, this is an indication that the languages came from somewhere else, somewhere with flint. And of course, natural environment. If you live on the seashore, you have words for the sea. If you don't, you probably don't. Large rivers, mountains, people that live on a huge plateau and have never seen a mountain are unlikely to have vocabulary for mountains or mountain ranges. And again, language contact. When we can see what kind of loan words the language has taken from which languages at which relative point in time, we can use this to locate the language at that point in time. For example, again, with the Uralic languages, they have very early Aryan loanwords, so they must have been spoken close to the Aryan languages to be influenced by them. Of course, in this case, that is not. If we only think about this contact, it is not very helpful because it only establishes that the Aryan and the Proto-Uralic languages were spoken close to each other. But taken together with all the other evidence, you start to get a better idea of where and when this happened. So then the last table. The next slide will be getting into the language groups themselves and their maps. Here I have some typical characteristics for these language groups. These are not universal. Some language groups have outliers that are less like the other members of the group, but generally this is how it works. The grammatical alignment might be something that you have never heard about. It's a fairly, let's say, relatively high level concept, because the other kind of languages are rarely met by Western people. The kind of alignment we have, or we are used to, are the nominative accusative languages. So you have a nominative for the person who is doing and accusative for the thing that is being worked upon. So for example, John comes, John is in the nominative, there's nothing that is being worked upon, so there's nothing in the accusative. But when John reads a book, John is in nominative and the book is in accusative. Now this is, as you can see, the case for almost all of these language groups. But the North Caucasian and the Basque languages are ergative absolutive languages. So in this case, this flips around. So when you say John comes, John is in the ergative. Or the absolutive. And when you say John reads a book, it is no longer John, but now it is the book that is in the absolutive. So this is kind of like saying the book was read by John. But grammatically, this is the simplest way of putting it. And then when you say John has reads the book, John is in ergative. So the person who is doing something when something concrete is being done is different than the person doing something that happens on its own or that they do to themselves. This can be very confusing, but in a future presentation I have an example from Sumerian which might clear this up when you see it in writing. Then the morphological group. This is again one where we have two groups with one and the others with another type. Here the Indo-European and Afro-Asiatic languages are all fusional languages. Fusional means that there is a chain of things that you put on the end of the word that carry meaning. And in fusional languages, these can carry several meanings. For example, for verbs, for example in Russian, you say "Я думаю," I think, and the "you" at the end of "думать" contains the person and the time. So two components. And for example, with Latin adjectives, if you have bonus or malus, good or bad, the us at the end signifies the number, one, the gender, masculine, and the case, nominative. And if you change any of these three components, you will have to put something else than us at the end. And in contrast, the agglutinative languages are languages where these units of meaning come in a chain. So if you have a chain that contains singular, masculine, nominative, if you switch it from masculine to feminine, you just change one thing in the middle and the first and last parts remain the same. Japanese, for example, is also an example of this kind of language. For example, mimashita. There's mi, which means to see, masu, which is a polite marker, and ta, which is means that it is in the past. So it was seen polite, and you are speaking politely. But you can also say mita, where is mi is to see, and ta is for the past time. So you just remove the marker for being polite to be impolite. The marker at the end for the past time does not change. Then getting into grammatical gender, we will see that out of these 7, 4 of them have no grammatical gender. So when you talk about a key, the key is not female or male. This is also the case in English, although English is an outlier in the Indo-European languages. English has lost grammatical gender fairly recently, in the last 1000 years, I think. This is another one of these contact phenomena between North Sea Germanic and North Germanic languages. But in general, the Indo-European languages have male, female, and neutral genders. The original Proto-Indo-European only had living and neutral, so the male and female have split from that later in history, but this has happened in almost all Indo-European languages. In some languages, such as the Romance languages, the male and neutral genders have merged. So, for example, modern Italian or Spanish only have a male and female, both subdivisions that did not exist in the original Indo-European. Some languages have a combination of these, so you will have the original Proto-Indo-European had a distinction between living and non-living. From the current Germanic languages, for example, Swedish also has a differentiation between living and non-living. It had male, female, neutral for a time, but in the case of Swedish, it was the male and female that have merged. So there is now a living and a neutral. I believe Polish has genders that are combined male living, male neutral, so non-living, and then female and neutral in general, non-masculine neutral. But I don't speak any Polish, so I can't say much to that. The Afro-Asiatic languages generally have a male and female differentiation, but they have an interesting attribute in that they have a polarity in the adjectives. So if you are talking about, let's say, a large man, you will use the adjective that is female, and the noun that is male. So female big, male man, and opposite, a small woman, you would say small man, small male, woman female. I don't know how this came to be, but it's certainly interesting. And then finally, for North Caucasian languages, we have a complicated, because these languages have other kinds of ways of differentiating between what we would conceptualize as genders than living, dead, male, female. I don't know what they are. I don't speak any of these languages, so I can't really help further with that. But they have a system of grammatical gender that is not understandable, that is not readily understandable for us Westerners. You might also want to remember that grammatical gender and gender pronouns are not the same thing. For example, English still retains gendered personal pronouns, but no grammatical gender. In contrast, for example, the Uralic and Turkic languages have neither of these. Most Indo-European and Afro-Asiatic languages have both of them. And finally, getting into the negative, so how you say something is not. The most common is a particle, a negative particle, so like not. This is a word on its own that does not act like another part of a word. Then the Turkic and North Caucasian languages have negative affixes. This is also a way that exists in Japanese. So within this agglutinative chain, there is a component that is negative. So it means that the word is not the way it otherwise would be. For example, from Japanese, mita nakatta, I didn't see it. So there's a na in the middle that means that you did not see it. And for the Uralic languages, there is a negative verb. So, like you would say, I do, he does. You would say, I know, he know, known. This is fairly difficult to conceptualize for people with no experience with this kind of a construct. But it is not unique. There are some other language groups around the world with the same construct. I think the Dravidian languages in southern India, for example, also have a negative verb. In general, I am not aware of any characteristic of a language that would be unique. If you look globally, there is almost always, when not quite always, some kind of another language that does the same thing. So, finally getting into the language groups themselves. Let's start with the branches of the Indo-European family. Here we are missing some arrows at the top, and this is because the development process of the Indo-European languages is not quite clear. It appears that the Indo-European languages spread very explosively at the beginning of the Bronze Age. Listening to archaeologists, it appears that this might have been caused by a plague wave spreading from east, from Central Asia and into Europe to populations who at that time had no immunity to the plague, whereas the Indo-Europeans did. and the Indo-Europeans would have then been able to spread into this hole left by massive die-offs of the previous European population. In any case, because of some process, these languages spread explosively, and because of that it is difficult to reconstruct how they branched from each other. There are some which are clearly related, like the Italic and Celtic languages with each other, the Baltic and Slavic languages with each other, and the Aryan languages with each other. So these are the Iranian and Indo-Aryan language groups. And there are some with questionable groupings, such as Germanic might be more closely related to the Italo-Celtic or to the Balto-Slavic. Hellenic, so containing Greek, might be closely related to the Armenian languages, but these are spoken on opposite ends of the Black Sea, so how exactly this happened is somewhat unclear. So here on the bottom I have some modern languages that belong to these groups. For the Italo-Celtic languages you have the Mediterranean European languages, that's Italian, French, Romanian in the east, and then the Celtic languages such as Irish Gaelic, Welsh, Breton in northwestern France. For Germanic languages we have English, German, Swedish. Gothic is already disappeared, but I wanted to include it as it is one of the East Germanic languages that contained Gothic are one of the main groups of Germanic languages. The Balto-Slavic languages contain Baltic languages such as Latvian and Lithuanian, which are fairly conservative, and then the Slavic languages, which went through a very strong expansion in the Middle Ages and expanded from the border region between current Poland and Ukraine to cover a huge area in Eastern and Southeastern Europe. This is why the Slavic languages are fairly similar to each other. It's because they have split from each other fairly recently. So the Albanian languages contain Albanian, and historically this might be a kind of Illyrian. The Illyrian languages are something that we know from Roman and Greek sources, but we do not know what their languages were like. But the Illyrians lived approximately in the area where Albanian survives, so it seems likely that Albanian would be a dialect of Illyrian. The Hellenic languages, of course, contain Greek, certainly also Macedonian. We are talking about the classical Macedonia here, so Alexander the Great, not like the former Yugoslav Republic of, and might have contained Thracian, Thracian, but again, with many antique languages we know their names, we might know some ethnological information about them, but not really enough about their languages to group them, even if we might be able to tell that it was a Indo-European language, we usually cannot tell what kind of. For example, Venetic in the area of Venice might have been Italic, it might have been Celtic, it might have belonged to a third major group of this series of siblings that no longer survives. We just don't know. When it comes to Armenian, it's basically only Armenian. The Aryan languages are spoken very widely. They include Kurdish, Persian. Persian is the major language of the Islamic Republic of Iran, which was the empire of was formerly called the Persian Empire. And then the languages of northern India, such as Hindi and Bengali. The last two are languages that have died out, language groups that have died out. They were also the first two to split off from the other Indo-European languages. The Anatolian languages were spoken in Anatolia, where the Republic of Turkey is today. These include Hittite, Ludic, Luwic, some of the legendary kings such as Croesus and Midas were Anatolian. And then finally, Tocharian languages were spoken in the Tarim Basin in the most western part of current China, Xinjiang, which is today home to Turkic speakers. This disappeared perhaps 800 AD, so in the Middle Ages. I am going to draw a little the hypothesis that I believe in would be like this. Here would have a Western group of Indo-European, from which Balto-Slavic split off, and then it split into Germanic and Italo-Celtic. This is what I believe to be true, but it is not fact. And then a southern group containing the Albanian, Hellenic, and Armenian, and an eastern group with the Aryan, and then prior to this, the Tocharian and Anatolian. Whether or not this is actually what happened, I don't know, but it's the one that I personally think is the most likely, which is often the most objective that we can get to with this kind of ancient history of languages. And then we have a map. Here in black, in southern Ukraine and Russia, is the core area of the Indo-European languages. So if we paint the same arrows here, we would have the Western group. Excuse me, it's not working. Oh, pardon me, I was drawing on the wrong layer. Draw on the map. So we would have the Northwestern group here with the Baltic, and then the Germanic and Italo-Celtic. The southern group is very difficult to draw because it splits almost immediately into the west and the east. And then we would have the eastern group into Iranian and Indo-Aryan, and historically Anatolian, Tocharian. Where I have drawn white are areas that are still majority Indo-European speaking, and the red ones are areas that were at some point majority Indo-European speaking but are not anymore. For the case of the Tarim Basin, Central Asia and Turkey, this is because of the Turkic languages that have since spread into these areas. For Northern Africa, this was an area that was fairly strongly Latinized during the Roman Empire, but has since the Latin-speaking population was assimilated by the Arabs after the Arab conquests. So if the Arab conquests had not happened, we might have a North African Romance language, and it might be quite conservative if it had not started to diverge, as what we know about North African Latin was that it was very similar to Sardinian Latin, and Sardinian has remained very close to Latin since then. Then I have some detail maps for the Indo-European languages, as these are this is a huge language group, so if I wanted to show some details, I had to make some extra maps. This is for the Celtic languages. So again, the Celtic core area is north of the Alps, so Switzerland, Austria. Places with surviving Celtic place names are found in the western area in the Schwarzwald, so the Black Forest in southernmost Germany, and the Juragebirge, so Jura Mountains, perhaps Jura. I'm not sure if this mountain range is called by its German or French pronunciation in English. But both of these are places that were very unpopulated, small amount of people, and they may have survived as Celtic speaking until the Germans arrived. The white area in this case is the maximal spread of the Celtic languages. For some of these areas, such as Gaul, Gallia, France, and the British Isles, and northern Italy, we know that these were overwhelmingly Celtic-speaking. For some, it's not quite as clear, such as here Pannonia, modern Hungary, or in Iberia, in modern Spain. We know that there were some Celts there, but they may have been a minority. They might have been an elite population. They might have lived in isolated villages apart from the other language groups. We just don't know. Again, we are lucky to know that they even existed from historical sources. Having scientific information would be almost too much to ask. This blob here in Turkey is Galatia. This was an area with an existing Celtic-speaking population in the antiquity. And you may have heard of this area if you have familiarity with the New Testament. There's an epistle to the Galatians, which is directed at early churches in this area. And in this case, I have reversed my ways, and I have used red to mark where the Celtic languages still survive. So only in peripheral areas and quite far away from the original core areas of this language group. The next one are the Baltic languages. Here the core is around Lithuania. They are still being spoken in Lithuania and Latvia, but were previously also spoken in Prussia and large parts of Belarus. Of course, these have since been assimilated into the closely related Slavic language group. The next one will be about the Iranian languages, because these have had quite an adventure. The original area of the Aryan languages, to be quite exact, appears to have been on the eastern fringe of the original Indo-European area. But it came to dominate the entire steppe region and subsume any Proto-Indo-European languages that survived in this area. But it also went on an adventure towards the east, southeast, through Central Asia and into the mountains. This is a somewhat unusual thing to happen. Language groups rarely cross major climate regions, so the Aryans staying on the steppe would have been expected. Crossing the desert into the south is unusual, not unheard of. I can think of maybe 5 or 6 language groups that have jumped climates, but I imagine I could name dozens of language groups that have not. And in the south, this spread west and into Afghanistan and Pakistan on the east. Further east of that, you get into the Indo-Aryan languages, which are closely related to these ones. The northernmost areas, for example, if you read antique sources, you will run into Scythians and Sarmatians, and these were Aryan-speaking nations that lived on the north side of the Black Sea, so current Ukraine. Basically, all of the steppe areas of the Aryan languages were later assimilated into the Turkic languages, another steppe-bound language group. Where the Iranian languages survive is further south, in the Persian sphere. So we have Kurdish here in the mountains of eastern Turkey, northern Iraq or western Iran, and then Persian in Iran, Pashto, Balochi in Afghanistan and Pakistan. Some of the northernmost coastal areas of the Caspian Sea have been assimilated into Turkish languages. For example, Azerbaijan is around here, and the Azeris speak a Turkish language. Mesopotamia was Iranian speaking for some time, but has since been reabsorbed into the Semitic languages. Then, getting into the Afro-Asiatic languages, now we have some nice arrows to begin with. Some of the first split was most likely between the south and the north, where the south contains the Omotic languages. Maybe this is somewhat controversial. I am for it, but I am not the top expert in this context, so if you don't want to believe it, I don't hold it against you. This is a very small language group that contains languages that most Westerners have certainly never heard of. I was of the opinion that Bambasi is most likely the most famous of these, but I don't expect anyone listening to have heard of it. And the other southern branch are the Cushitic languages. Kush was the Egyptian name of the countries to the south of Egypt that the Egyptians absolutely loathed. They often refer to vile Kush. Well, of course, the neighboring country that you are always at war with is unlikely to be a friendly country. The largest surviving language of this branch is the Somali language from the Horn of Africa. And within the northern group, we have the African group, which contains on the one side Egyptian and on the other side the Berber and Chadic languages. The Chadic languages, as you might guess, are spoken in Chad, among other things, among other areas. And these appear to have been brought into sub-Saharan Africa across the Sahara. This is largely based on genetic information that I am not particularly familiar with. But as the archaeologists tell us, it appears that the Chadic languages came from the Mediterranean area in historical times. The Egyptian branch, of course, contains Egyptian. Egyptian languages were spoken for thousands of years in the Kingdom of Egypt, and they survived until perhaps 1600 AD, even in Islamic Egypt. Eventually they were replaced by Arabic, and today you can, if you want to hear Egyptian, you can go to a Coptic Christian mass in Egypt, and they might use Egyptian as a liturgic language. So in the same way that if you go to a particularly conservative Catholic church, they might still be speaking Latin when they are doing their rituals. If you go to a particularly conservative Coptic church, they might be speaking Egyptian. But to my knowledge, no one speaks Egyptian as a living language anymore. So the other branch of the African group are the Berber languages that were spoken in northern Africa. These have also mostly been replaced by Arabic since then. If you have heard, or if you know the French football player Zinedine Zidane, he is a native Kabyle Berber. So imagine him and you have a Berber. This language group contains both the northern coast of Africa as well as particularly the Tuareg languages are spoken within Sahara itself. And then an example of a Chadic language would be Hausa. And then we get into the Semitic languages, which contain, for example, Akkadian that we already spoke about, and then Aramaic, which barely survives if you go to a Christian church in Syria, or if you did 10 years ago, you might hear them holding their mass in Aramaic. Hebrew had already died out, but was resurrected after the Second World War. Arabic has become a massive global language because of the Arab expansion in the 600s AD. and Amhara is an example of from Ethiopia. So this is a Semitic language in Africa. And once we get to the map, I will draw an arrow showing how this happened. But basically, it's making a very taking a very long road north, then east, then south, then west across the sea. So at this point, I promised to draw something about the internal structure of the Semitic group for Mr. Pig. So we have Semitic as the large grouping, and within Semitic we have East, and here we have Akkadian, and we have non-East, let's say West Central. So this contains then the West and Central groups. And Arabic is a central Semitic language. Here we go into the South Semitic languages such as Amhara and some of the languages of Yemen and Oman. And the central languages contain Arabic. And the West Semitic languages contain Aramaic and Hebrew. So this is the kind of language family that you have. So when you start with Arabic, you have to go back 2 steps and then one to the side and down to arrive at Hebrew. And from Arabic, you have to go 3 steps backwards and 1 to the side and then down to get into Akkadian. And then from Semitic, you would go like this to reach Egyptian. So Arabic is starting to be quite distantly related to Egyptian, but it is clearly related. Then getting into the maps. The original area of the Afro-Asiatic languages, in my opinion, is in the northeastern part of Africa. This is another case where there are various hypotheses to this, but to get really into them, we would have to have an episode just for that. So, with Ethiopia, this is very close to the original area of the Afro-Asiatic languages. So to get Semitic languages down here, you would have to first make this round and then come back around here. So in this, the area around Ethiopia, you will have Omotic languages, so likely one of the southern group, and then you have the Cushitic languages, also from the southern group, but then you also have Semitic languages from the northern group. So this gets quite complicated. Egyptian was spoken roughly in this area, and then the Berber languages in northern Africa and also the Canary Islands, and they have since spread once camels arrived from Central Asia. Camels are not native to Africa. The Berber languages spread into the Sahara, and the Chadic languages appear to have arrived from the Mediterranean into the Sahel region. The Sahel is a dry steppe area south of the Sahara. So if you hear the Sahel-Sahara being spoken of together at some point, that's what it means. It's the border region between the desert and getting into forested Africa. And here in Mesopotamia is where Akkadian was spoken. So the earliest written languages of the Afro-Asiatic group are geographically not that different from each other, but are fairly distant in their development. So this was able to help us reconstruct the family far into the past. Then the next language group, getting into the Uralic languages. Here we have again a fairly nice split, first into the East and Central West groups. The Eastern were spoken mostly in Western Siberia, because this contains Hungarian that's since spread into Central Europe and was able to spread in an area with a large population base, much more so than Siberia. Hungarian actually produces the majority of Uralic speakers. So there are perhaps 20 million Uralic speakers, and 10 million of these are Hungarians. Probably a little more, because I think the Republic of Hungary has 10 million people and the neighboring areas have Hungarian minorities. Historically, these were spoken in Western Siberia, so east of the Ural Mountains, and the other ones then in Eastern Europe. In the central Uralic area seems to be the original area of the Uralic languages, so it is you could kind of put it at the top, but that would make the tree look very weird. And these have developed into Permian and Mari languages, which are minority languages in Eastern Russia. I think these have a combined population of about 1 million. The East Uralic languages outside of Hungarian have maybe 100,000. And then the West group contains the upper reaches of the Volga, and then spreading to the west and the north. So there the Mordvin languages, Erzha and Moksha, are also minority languages within Russia. I think these also have about 500,000 speakers between them. And then the Finnic languages are spoken in Finland and Estonia and are minority languages in Sweden, Norway and Russia. The Sami languages are spoken in Lapland, northern Scandinavia, and they are minority languages everywhere. Because this area is split between countries with population bases in the south, even if there are local areas in Lapland that are or were recently majority Sami speaking, they necessarily become a small minority in a country with a large population in the south. So another comment from Pig. Hungarians, Magyars, I'm sure are far away geographically from their cousins. Yes, they are extremely far away. The Hungarians, to our knowledge, are the only Uralics to have undergone a migration, such as the migration period is named after. And I will talk about it a little bit here on the map. So here again, the black area is the original speaking area of the Uralic languages. We have the Eastern Uralic languages here in Siberia. And what appears to have happened with the Hungarians is that the Samoyeds are the easternmost dialect group, and the Ugrics are the westernmost. So if you hear someone talk about Finno-Ugrics, this is almost synonymous with the Uralic languages. The idea in Finno-Ugric is to exclude the Samoyeds and only keep the languages that are the European national languages. So you take Finnish, Estonian and Hungarian, and you go backwards in time until you get the node that they would have split from. But this is an antiquated view. It used to be viewed that the Samoyed languages had split away from the Uralic languages first, and after that the Ugaric languages, including Hungarian, would have split off from the main group. But this does not appear to be the case. Apparently, so the current view is that these two split off together and split off from each other after that. So with the Hungarians, it seems that the Hungarians were the southernmost Ugaric-speaking group, and they somehow, we do not know because this happened shortly AD in an area where nobody was writing, but they took over some material culture from either Aryan or Turkic-speaking steppe nomads, so horse riders, and moved from the forested area into the steppe area. How exactly this adventure continued is not quite clear. It appears that they may have first migrated into Europe and then remained there for some time. There are some signs of mutual contact between the Central Uralic languages and Hungarian, which is the reason that we think they stopped there. And then where we see them historically is here in Western Ukraine. They appear in the 700s or 800s AD as a marauding barbarian nation, much like the Goths or the Huns. Then, for 100 years or so, they continue existing as a raiding nation. For example, there are areas in Saxony and in northern Italy, and I think even in eastern France, where European settled armies fought against the Hungarians, and finally they ended up settling in the Pannonian Basin, where Hungarians live today in the early 900s. And they continued to live in Pannonia, managed to assimilate the local population to their language instead of being assimilated into the local language, and around 1000 AD became Christian. And mostly, written information in the Hungarian language mostly starts appearing after Christianization. There are some very fragmentary runic inscriptions in Hungarian from before that, but very few. And once they start being Christians and become assimilated into the settled European cultural sphere, they start writing an awful lot more. So, then getting into the Central Uralic languages, the border between the Central and Western is something like this, and then the Western languages, something like this, where the Morotvinic languages are or were spoken here in the more southern areas. The Finnic languages, then in Finland, Estonia, Karelia, and the Sami languages in Lapland, but further in the past, further south, perhaps even this far south. So the Sami languages have spread from their original area into the north and into the west, and then the Finnic languages have also spread into the north, sort of driving back the Sami language area. So the Sami languages have a total amount of speakers of about 50,000 or so. All of them are either threatened or on the verge of extinction. There are initiatives to support their survival, but we'll have to see what happens. Effort doesn't necessarily translate into results. Then getting into the Turkic languages. The first to split are both very small minority languages. The Chuvash language is spoken in southern Russia, close to the Uralic, Central Uralic language areas, and the Kalaj language is spoken in Iran, quite far from each other. The vast majority of surviving Turkic languages are the so-called Common Turkic, so these are fairly closely related to each other, and they came from the east into Central Asia, which was Iranian speaking at the time, and these four major groups seem to have spread from Central Asia. So we have both cardinal direction names for them, so northwest. Turkic are the languages that spread into the northwest over the Black Sea. We will have a map to this. And this contains minority languages in Russia, such as Tatar, and then some of the Central Asian languages, such as Kazakh and Kyrgyz. The southwest went southwest on the south side of the Caspian Sea, and these contain the Turkish languages in Anatolia, so Turkish, Azeri, and Turkmen is the southwesternmost Central Asian Turkish language. And the northeast Siberian languages are spoken in the direction northeast in Siberia. And these contain the Yakut language and Tuvan language. If someone in the audience is an avid Hearts of Iron player, you may have noticed a tiny country called Tannu between Russia or the Soviet Union and Mongolia. And this is where the Tuvan language is spoken. And then the southeast group, also called Karluk, Turkish, contains the Uzbek, which are one of the Central Asian Turkic languages, and Uyghur, which is the majority language of Xinjiang in current northwestern China, but are again a tiny minority language within the People's Republic of China, which has a huge population in the east. So these were a majority population in their own area, but became conquered by a country that has a huge population somewhere else, and in that way became a minority language. Getting into a map of the Turks. So we have the northwest here. These have mostly disappeared. For example, the country of Bulgaria, which is Slavic speaking today, is named after these Kipchak Turkish Bulgarians. If you hear about a Volga Bulgaria, that is also a Kipchak Turkish group in current southern Russia. These produced a majority population for the parts of the Ukraine for a time period, but they have since been assimilated into Slavic population spreading from the north. Then the Oghuz to the southwest. Here we have Turkey. There used to be a sizable Turkish population in Europe, but because of the wars in the Balkans around before, after the First World War, and population transfers between the Balkan countries and Turkey, where Christians were moved from Turkey into Greece, for example, and Muslims were moved from Greece into Turkey. The Turkish-speaking population in Europe has almost disappeared. The Azeris are also this kind of Turks, and the Turkmens. Northernmost Iran or Persia, also had a Turkish-speaking population for a period of time, but this has also been assimilated into the more numerous and powerful Persian. The Uzbeks are around here, and Xinjiang is here. So this is the southeastern Turkish area. Finally, the northeast is into Siberia. We don't exactly know where the Turks came from. They are out of the groups that we are aware of, most likely the Xiongnu, that are a northern barbarian group in Chinese history, are most likely to be the ancestors of the Turks. They spread into the West for some reason in the early Middle Ages and were able to assimilate the Aryan population of Central Asia, so that today Central Asia is entirely Turkish speaking. Then the final smaller language groups, we have the Vasconian languages, which only contain Basque. These likely came from northern Africa in the Stone Age. And then we have the North Caucasian and South Caucasian languages, which might be related to each other, but if they are, it is more distant than we can reliably date. We don't really know where either of these came from. They may have been present in the Caucasus Mountains for many, many thousands of years, and in that case they might be the most original language groups of Europe, but we just don't know. They certainly had other branches at some point, so cousins, uncle languages, but these have been eliminated, so we just don't have the information. To give a map to the Basque language, I will draw the border between Spain and France. So there's a small area in southwestern France and a small area in northern Spain where Basque is being spoken. It was on its way to be eliminated, but I think it is making something of a comeback. It's still not a particularly large or vital. It is a language with low vitality. And the red area here is about where the Vasconian languages seem to have been spoken in the Roman period. So they have lost quite a lot of area in the last couple of thousand years, but have not yet been entirely eliminated. The last one are the Caucasian languages. So you have the North Caucasian, north of the Caucasus, and the South Caucasian south of it. These are difficult to talk about because they are very marginal. The amounts of speakers for the North Caucasian languages are, again, I think in the tens or hundreds of thousands. And this is split between perhaps 10 or 20 different languages. The one that I can remember is Abkhaz, which is spoken here on the Black Sea coast. And that's basically it. For the southern group, the large member is Georgian, and the other members are mostly minority languages within Georgia or the neighboring countries. Georgian has a very distinctive writing style, and they produce a lot of wine, so you might have run into a wine bottle with these strange rounded symbols. That has been Georgian, if you have seen it. So, with this we have come to the end of this presentation. If you have questions or comments, please write them out. I will wait a period of time. And I've been, for any listeners who were not present in the pre-recording phase, I have purchased the game The Life and Suffering of Sir Brante, which is kind of choose your own adventure kind of game. Features a lot of text, and I was planning to try streaming this. So for listeners who like listening to my voice, you may be able to get some more of it outside of these fairly high effort presentations that I cannot make more than one of per week, and perhaps building up, having a light activity would also help build up friendly relationship between myself and the viewers, so that in the future he would have an easier time commenting or asking questions about the presentations themselves as well. So it appears that we are out of questions and comments. Then simply thank you for coming. I hope this has been interesting, and I hope the people watching the archive on Twitch or YouTube have also found this interesting. If you want to ask me something or comment something, you can do this at my Twitter account, either posting at me or sending private messages to me. I promise not to bully you. So then, la missa è finita. Thank you for coming to my TED Talk. Have a nice period of time that is current to you, and perhaps we will see each other tomorrow with some suffering of Sobrante.